300 drones pointed at the United States from Cuba. That sentence alone already sounds like the beginning of a major international crisis. And yet, in Washington, some analysts no longer consider this scenario completely impossible. Because today, the United States is seeing the return of an old geopolitical nightmare, Cuba becoming a strategic threat again, just a few miles from American shores. And what changes everything in this story is the very nature of the threat. Back in the 1960s, the world feared Soviet nuclear missiles installed in Cuba. Today, the fear has a different name: drones. Small, fast, sometimes almost invisible to radar, capable of spying, jamming communications, overwhelming air defenses, or even striking sensitive infrastructure. And above all, far cheaper than conventional missiles. That is exactly what worries the American military, because a modern attack no longer necessarily looks the way people imagined in the past. There are not always fighter jets in the sky or immediate explosions. Modern warfare can begin silently, with a wave of drones. Dozens, then hundreds, arriving simultaneously from multiple directions. And the problem for the United States is that even the world's leading military power is beginning to face an uncomfortable reality. No defense system is fully prepared to handle massive attacks by cheap drones. Recent wars have proven it. In Ukraine, drones costing only a few $1,000s have sometimes destroyed military equipment worth millions. In the Middle East, highly protected oil facilities have been hit despite sophisticated defense systems. In other words, military technology is evolving faster than security doctrines. And that is where Cuba becomes an explosive issue. Because geographically, the island is extremely close to the United States. We are talking about less than 150 kilometers between Cuba and Florida. For Washington, that proximity changes the entire level of alert. Because if a hostile power truly possessed drone infrastructure in that area, American response times would be dramatically reduced. And in military matters, a few minutes can completely change a situation. Now, obviously, we must remain rigorous. At this stage, there is no public evidence confirming the existence of an operational force of 300 armed drones in Cuba. But that may not even be the most important point. The real issue is that this possibility is starting to circulate seriously in certain strategic discussions. And when a military hypothesis begins to worry the Pentagon, it immediately stops being just a rumor. Because today, the United States sees several warning signs converging at the same time. The growing ties between Cuba and Russia, China's technological rise, global geopolitical tensions, and above all, the revolution of military drones. All of this creates an extremely tense atmosphere, especially since Washington already feels pressure on multiple fronts. Ukraine, Taiwan, the Middle East, the Red Sea, cyber attacks, trade tensions with Beijing, and now, the possibility of a new hostile strategic axis appearing just miles from American territory. What is most alarming in this story is not only Cuba itself, it is what Cuba symbolizes. Because if hostile drones can truly be positioned so close to the United States, then it means something very simple. American territory may no longer be as unreachable as before. And in the corridors of power in Washington, that idea is beginning to seriously disturb people. For a long time, many people viewed Cuba as a secondary player on the global stage, an economically weakened island, under sanctions, politically isolated, militarily outdated. But in geopolitics, there is one very simple rule. A country can be weak and still remain extremely strategic. And Cuba is probably one of the best examples of that in the world. Because the island sits in a location the United States considers vital to its national security. Less than 150 kilometers separate Cuba from Florida. To understand how important that distance is, you have to imagine what it means militarily. At that proximity, everything changes. Response times become shorter, surveillance capabilities become more effective, intelligence operations become easier, and above all, pressure capabilities increase dramatically. That is exactly why Washington has monitored Cuba with almost obsessive attention for decades. And that obsession comes directly from history. In 1962, the entire planet nearly fell into nuclear war because of Cuba. The Soviet Union had begun installing nuclear missiles on the island. The United States immediately viewed it as an existential threat. The world stood on the edge of catastrophe. For several days, the two largest nuclear powers on Earth were prepared to confront each other directly. And even though that crisis officially belongs to the past, it left a deep scar in America's strategic memory. Since that moment, Washington has believed that no rival power should maintain a major military presence in Cuba. The problem today is that military technology has completely changed. Back then, massive missile launch sites had to be installed and could easily be detected by satellites. Today, the threat can be far more discreet. Drones can be stored inside containers, moved quickly, launched from mobile platforms, or even deployed temporarily before disappearing. And for American intelligence agencies, that is a nightmare. Because drone infrastructure does not necessarily look like a traditional military base, it can be much harder to detect. That is what makes this issue so sensitive. And there is another crucial point. Modern drones are not only designed to attack, they can also spy, monitor military movements, intercept communications, map sensitive installations, test air defense systems, or conduct electronic warfare operations. In other words, even without firing a single missile, a drone fleet can already represent a major strategic advantage. And that is where Cuba becomes attractive again for America's rivals. Because being so close to U.S. territory potentially makes the island an ideal position to monitor activities around Florida, American military bases, and strategic maritime routes. And when you look at a map, you immediately understand why the United States takes this issue so seriously. Florida is not just any territory. It is a major military hub. Important air bases are located there, strategic naval installations, critical infrastructure, and, above all, direct access to the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. So, naturally, any foreign military presence in that area immediately attracts Pentagon attention. But there is something even more concerning. Because drones are not only dangerous individually, the real danger comes from swarm attacks. That means dozens or even hundreds of drones being used simultaneously to overwhelm defenses. And this kind of strategy is becoming increasingly realistic technologically. Artificial intelligence now allows some drones to coordinate their movements, modify their trajectories automatically, and even continue missions despite electronic jamming. In short, the wars of the future could look like waves of autonomous drones that are extremely difficult to stop. And for Washington, the worst-case scenario would be precisely this: the emergence near American territory of a capability able to massively complicate U.S. air defense. Because the real problem with drones is not only their power, it is their cost. A drone may cost only a few $1,000s, but the missile used to intercept it may cost hundreds of thousands or even millions. And that asymmetry deeply worries military planners, because in the long run, even a superpower can be pressured by much cheaper technologies. Cuba is becoming strategic again for one simple reason. The island could become an ideal platform to test a new form of military pressure against the United States, a pressure less visible than conventional war, but potentially much harder to manage. But this story becomes much more serious when we look at who could actually be behind rising tensions around Cuba. Because ultimately, the real issue may not be Cuba itself, The real issue is Russia and China, and especially the way these two powers are gradually trying to challenge American influence around the world. For years, Moscow and Beijing have pursued a very clear strategy: weaken U.S. dominance without necessarily entering into direct confrontation. And to do that, they use several methods: economic pressure, technological competition, diplomatic influence, cyber attacks, disinformation, and now, indirect military demonstrations. Cuba then becomes a potential piece in a much larger game. From Russia's perspective, the logic is fairly simple. Since the war in Ukraine began, relations between Moscow and Washington have collapsed. Western sanctions hit the Russian economy. NATO expanded. And Russia now believes it is engaged in a long-term confrontation with the United States. In that context, Moscow constantly seeks ways to respond to American pressure. And what could be more symbolic than returning to Washington's most sensitive zone, the Caribbean? For the Kremlin, the objective is also psychological: to make Americans understand, if you can approach our borders, we can approach yours. That is exactly the logic inherited from the Cold War. And in recent months, several signals have fueled those concerns. Russian military ships have been seen near Cuba. Joint military exercises have been discussed. Security cooperation has increased. Officially, Moscow calls it normal partnership. But in the United States, many see it as a way of testing America's reactions. And then there is China. And honestly, that may be the most important aspect of the entire issue. Because while Russia brings the geopolitical dimension, China brings the technology. Beijing has become one of the world leaders in drone development, and not only civilian drones. China is investing massively in autonomous military drones, artificial intelligence, drone swarms, electronic warfare, and systems capable of disrupting enemy communications. In other words, the technologies defining modern warfare. For Washington, the danger would therefore be less about a traditional Cuban base and more about an extremely difficult combination to manage: Cuban territory, Russian strategic backing, Chinese technology. And that combination deeply worries American strategists because it could allow rival powers to discreetly establish advanced capabilities extremely close to the United States. The problem for Washington is that China often advances much more subtly than Russia. Beijing generally avoids direct provocations. China's strategy relies more on gradual influence, investments, partnerships, technology, infrastructure, economic cooperation. And that is precisely what complicates the situation. Because it sometimes becomes difficult to distinguish what is civilian and what may have military applications. A commercial port can have strategic value. A technology center can collect data. A logistical partnership can become intelligence infrastructure. And in the case of drones, that line becomes even blurrier, because the same technologies can be used for agricultural monitoring, mapping, logistics, or military operations. As a result, the United States now views certain Sino-Cuban partnerships with far more suspicion than before, especially in a context where Washington already feels surrounded on multiple fronts. In Europe, there is Russia. In Asia, China around Taiwan. In the Middle East, tensions constantly flare up. And now, the Caribbean could once again become a strategic confrontation zone. The Pentagon also understands that modern war does not necessarily begin with a spectacular invasion. It can start with weak signals, discrete infrastructure, surveillance capabilities, electronic tests, reconnaissance drones, network disruptions. And that is exactly why this issue causes so much concern. Because this kind of hybrid military presence is much harder to interpret. Is it offensive preparation? A show of force? A psychological operation? Or simply diplomatic pressure? Nobody truly knows. But in relations between major powers, uncertainty is often the most dangerous thing of all. Because once a country begins doubting its rival's intentions, the risk of overreaction increases immediately. And that is exactly what makes this situation potentially explosive. Now we must ask the central question. Are we facing a real military threat? Or a massive psychological pressure operation designed to worry Washington? Because today, in modern conflicts, perception has become almost as important as military power itself. And that is what makes this 300 drones issue so difficult to analyze. On one hand, there is currently no public evidence confirming that a massive fleet of armed drones is already operational in Cuba. No undeniable satellite images, no official announcement, no clear military demonstration, and that absolutely needs to be stated to remain credible. But on the other hand, intelligence agencies never react only to certainties. They also react to signals, unusual movements, suspicious cooperation, partial information, potential capabilities. And in the intelligence world, a potential threat can be enough to trigger a strategic alert. Because waiting for definitive proof can sometimes mean waiting too long. That is exactly the mindset dominating major powers today. Anticipate danger before it becomes visible. And that is where drones completely change the rules of the game. Unlike Cold War nuclear missiles, drones create a much more ambiguous threat. A nuclear missile is visible, identifiable. It immediately represents an absolute red line. But drones are different. A drone can be civilian or military. A drone can monitor or attack. A drone can map an area or prepare an operation. This constant ambiguity creates an extremely dangerous gray zone. And that gray zone has become one of the favorite battlegrounds of major powers, because it allows pressure without officially triggering war. Today, states do not always seek to strike opponents directly. They often seek to create a permanent climate of uncertainty, create doubt, psychologically exhaust the adversary, force them to spend more, keep them constantly on alert. And in that domain, drones are perfect tools. Why? Because they are difficult to trace, low cost, flexible, and capable of generating enormous security anxiety. Imagine the Pentagon situation for a moment. If tomorrow dozens of unidentified drones appeared off the American coast, how should the U.S. react immediately? Is it a test? A provocation? An exercise? An intelligence operation? Or the beginning of a larger attack? The time needed to answer those questions can itself become a problem. And that is exactly what some modern strategies seek, to overwhelm the enemy's reaction capacity. Not necessarily destroy them immediately, but disorient them, exhaust them, create uncertainty. And the more geopolitical tensions rise, the more credible this type of scenario becomes. Because today, the world is entering a period where conflicts are less and less officially declared. People often speak of hybrid warfare. That means a combination of military pressure, cyber attacks, information warfare, economic sabotage, disinformation, and discrete technological operations. And drones have become one of the perfect symbols of this new type of confrontation. The most worrying thing is that this hybrid war can advance slowly, almost silently, without massive invasions, without official declarations, without spectacular images at the beginning, simply through an accumulation of constant pressure. And in that context, Cuba represents an extremely powerful symbol. Because for Americans, seeing a potential threat reappear so close to national territory automatically revives Cold War reflexes. Even if today's situation is very different, the problem is that in geopolitics, symbols matter enormously. And some analysts believe this entire affair may primarily be a psychological demonstration orchestrated to send Washington a very clear message. You are no longer untouchable. In other words, the United States can also feel the strategic pressure it exerts elsewhere in the world. And if that is truly the case, then this issue goes far beyond drones, because it may reveal something much deeper. The beginning of a world where several powers are now capable of directly challenging American influence, even near U.S. territory. And that is probably what worries Washington most. At its core, this drone story around Cuba goes far beyond military matters, because it raises a much more serious question. Is the world sliding back into a new Cold War? When we look at the global situation, the similarities are becoming increasingly troubling. On one side, the United States is trying to maintain its global dominance. On the other, Russia and China are gradually trying to challenge that balance. And in between, tensions are rising everywhere. In Europe with Ukraine, in Asia around Taiwan, in the Middle East through regional conflicts, in cyberspace through digital attacks, and now, potentially, in the Caribbean. The problem is that, unlike the first Cold War, today's world is far more technologically unstable. Back then, the rules were relatively clear. Major powers possessed enormous nuclear arsenals. Everyone understood the red lines. And above all, fear of mutual destruction often prevented direct confrontation. Today, the rules are becoming blurred because new technologies completely erase the line between peace and war. A drone can spy without being detected. A cyber attack can paralyze infrastructure without firing a single missile. A disinformation campaign can destabilize an entire country without a soldier crossing a border. The world is entering an era of permanent confrontation, but often invisible. And that is exactly what makes the current situation so dangerous. Because the more rivalries intensify, the greater the risk of mistakes. A misidentified drone, a naval incident, a military provocation, a misunderstanding of enemy intentions. Sometimes international crises do not begin with deliberate decisions. They begin with chains of mistakes, tensions, and overreactions. And history has already shown that many times. What is most alarming today is that major powers seem to be entering a long-term preparation phase. The United States is increasing military spending. China is accelerating military modernization. Russia is strengthening its war economy. Strategic alliances are multiplying. Geopolitical blocs are slowly reforming, as if the world were preparing for a prolonged confrontation. And in this new reality, drones play a central role, because they perfectly represent 21st century warfare. Less expensive, more mobile, harder to anticipate, and potentially accessible to many more actors. Before, only major powers could truly threaten a large territory. Today, relatively accessible technologies can create enormous strategic damage. That is the revolution taking place right now. And that is exactly why the American military takes this issue so seriously. Because if advanced drone networks can truly be positioned near U.S. territory, then America's entire security doctrine may need to evolve. For decades, the United States felt protected by geography. 2 oceans, massive military power, relatively stable neighbors. But the rise of drones, cyber attacks, and autonomous technologies completely changes that logic. Distance protects less than before. And that reality is beginning to transform the way Washington sees the world. Now, the threat is no longer necessarily a massive invasion or an immediate nuclear strike. The threat can be diffuse, silent, technological, permanent. And that is probably what makes this new era even more anxiety-inducing than the original Cold War. Because during the Cold War, the danger was visible. Today, it can remain invisible until the very last moment. Now, obviously, we should not fall into sensationalism. The world is not on the edge of imminent world war, and many scenarios being discussed remain hypothetical. But one thing is certain. Major powers are repositioning themselves strategically at an astonishing speed. And Cuba could become a symbol of that geopolitical shift, not necessarily as a giant military base, but as a signal. A signal that global rivalries are gradually moving closer to American territory. And if this dynamic continues, then the coming years could be marked by tensions far greater than the world imagined only recently. Because in geopolitics, there is one simple rule. When great powers begin testing each other this closely again, history becomes unpredictable.